let's get started. So first off, and I know this is going to absolutely irritate some of the more neurotic or obsessive compulsive types in my audience. No, specifically my wife, but I'm going to be switching up our plans a little bit today. Pastor asked me at the end of last session if we could cut the session short next week so we can all get to the baptism thing faster. And that didn't jive terribly well with trying to cover the entirety of the Eastern faith from like 400 to 1,000 in one session. So I'm switching it. We're going to talk about the Eastern Church today, and we're going to talk about Augustine almost exclusively next week. But that'll still be a good solid amount of discussion because Augustine is hugely important and has a lot to do with like all contemporary Christianity, Protestant and Catholic. So today we're going to focus on the Eastern Church, but before we get there, I want to talk about why it's separated at this point from the Western Church, which means we have to talk about the fall of Rome. We've spent week after week talking about the Roman Empire, about like the various ups and downs and the civil wars and the problems and the divisions and the emperors fighting other emperors and so on and so forth. This is the moment where it all really falls apart, collapses. In 410 AD, Rome is sacked by the Visigoths. They sweep in, they just wreck the city, they take what they want, some people stay, some people leave, and there's just a whole mess. And Rome is never going to be the same after this. Like, it will occasionally have moments of sort of autocracy and independence. It will have moments where it's like subjected to the Eastern Empire, but it's never consistent and it's never going to be safe in Rome anymore until literally the Renaissance. Like for the next 1,000 years, Rome is going to be in a constant state of like discontent, discomfort, and potential takeover at any moment. And part of the reason why this is because of the Huns, actually. I think of this as kind of like when I go home and I try and cram too many socks into my drawer, they spill out the back and I end up having to dig into my dresser to get the other socks. The same is true with land and territory. When a new force shows up, like Attila and his Huns, and says, we're going to take over all of Russia, then everyone who's currently in Russia gets displaced. They start moving west. And when Attila gets even more greedy and he starts taking more territory, then he keeps displacing more and more people. And that's what I love about this map. It kind of gives you a sense of exactly all of the movement that is taking place here. So we have Attila sweeping in from Russia in the east. He is pushing everybody else out of the way. So the blue lines, these are the Visigoths, and they are trying desperately to get out of the way of the Hunnic invasion. They're moving south into the Balkan Peninsula, and when the Huns come deeper into the Balkan Peninsula, threatening and demanding tribute from Constantinople, they sweep back up, and they end up displaced into Italy. The Goths are the guys who are primarily going to be running the Italian show for the next 200 to 300 years. They're going to be the immediate threat to Rome. It will be under Ostrogothic control for quite a while. But a number of Goths are also going to get displaced into Spain, where they will run the show until the Islamic invasion, which we'll talk about later this session. But the other major force that we need to talk about are the Vandals, the red line here. They also get displaced as the Huns are pushing through, only the Vandals get creative, and after sweeping through Spain and getting kicked out by the Visigoths, they jump the Straits of Gibraltar and end up sweeping through northern Africa. And they basically wipe out the church in the process. The Goths, they're all Arians. Remember how Arianism was really good at sending missionaries all over the place? Well, that means that a lot of these barbarian forces, a lot of these invading forces are Arian, which means that they're sympathetic to the church, but not entirely friendly, and their political differences are kind of the driving force behind their conquest. So on the one hand, we have the Visigoths, they're coming in, they're sweeping through Rome, they're taking over Spain. We've got the Vandals sweeping through North Africa and causing major trouble down there. It's the Vandals who are going to be besieging Augustine when we talk about him next week. The other guys we need to keep track of who aren't on this map, but who are on the next map, are the Franks and the Burgundians. The Franks and the Burgundians, if the name doesn't sound familiar, are the people who are going to be running France for the next 1,000 years and change. Hence, Franks, France, It's not that far. This is the whole territory of Gaul, the way that the Romans have been talking about it in the past. And the Franks have always been kind of trouble, but they've also kind of stood still. They didn't seem terribly displaced by the Hunnic invasions. But weirdly, the Franks are actually going to be the closest allies of the Roman Church. They are also converted to Arianism, but very quickly the Franks and then the Burgundians will convert to the Nicene faith. They will give up their Arian heritage. And in fact, most of these forces are going to convert to Nicene Christianity in the next couple hundred years, which means they're all kind of Christians together, but again, it's the political differences that are really going to define this moment. They're still going to be fighting constantly. Europe is not going to be a safe place for, again, the next several hundred years until Charlemagne takes over, and even then, like, that just ushers in a new form of discontent and unrest. These are dark times. This is why this is usually referred to as the Dark Ages in old textbooks. Like, a lot of cool things are happening. There are a lot of good theologians. There's a lot of interesting stuff, and some of that we'll talk about next week when we talk about Augustine. But at the moment, Europe is very much an open question as far as who rules it, as far as how its politics work. It is a dark, bloody time of constant conflict and constant uncertainty. And the church, because it is one of the few institutions left that is organized and that does have this sort of internal hierarchical structure, and because most of these forces are, at least in name, Christian, Christianity is going to largely fill that power vacuum. Where Christianity was a major political force under Constantine, well, now it's going to become the only political force, which is how you get the Holy Roman Empire and Roman Catholicism being as dominant as it is throughout the Middle Ages. But we're not going to spend too much time talking about that right now. The next 3 weeks we are going to devote to the Western Roman Empire as it develops from the Roman Empire through the Holy Roman Empire all the way up to the Renaissance. That's like the plan going forward. But before we do that, I do want to spend some time focusing on the East. This is probably like the part of history that gets most overlooked. Like if you took a European history class or if you take Christian history classes, this is the part that frequently gets left out. I had to dig deeper to look at the Eastern Church, to look at the way that Orthodoxy came to be. And that's kind of what our goal for today is. We're going to talk about Orthodoxy, how it develops from what we've seen in the past, the Nicene Council, all the way to the takeover of the Byzantine Empire by the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire, in like the 11th century because of the Crusades. Because a lot happens here. And while the Western Roman Empire and everything that's going on in Rome and Italy and France and Germany is a giant mess, and we're calling it the Dark Ages, Byzantium is actually doing pretty well. They're not thriving necessarily, but their sort of downgoing is a lot slower and more gradual, which means that they've got a lot more time to still muck around with Christian issues and theology and other things like that. So that's the main thing I want to focus on today. And I want to stress especially the geography that we're dealing with before we get started. You'll remember Constantine founded Constantinople as the new capital of the empire. This was going to be the center of the world as far as Constantine was concerned. And again, you can see, like, it's a brilliant strategic positioning. It links the Balkan Peninsula with Asia Minor, which is increasingly the most, like, secure part of the entire Roman Empire. It links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. Like, it's just an obvious location for a city as a hub of trade, as a hub of just world politics. It's going to be super important. But you'll also remember that I've been stressing the religious centers throughout, specifically Antioch over here in Asia Minor and Alexandria down at the mouth of the Nile in Egypt. And this is the point where politics is really going to get its fangs into Christianity. This is where increasingly the issues are going to be less a matter of theological differences and more a matter of political differences masquerading as theological differences. Because Antioch and Alexandria have been running the theological show for a long time. Most of the dominant voices in the East have come from either Antioch or Alexandria. And as a result, a kind of rivalry is budding. Antioch sees itself not as one brotherhood with Alexandria, with Rome, with Constantinople, with all these other churches. Increasingly, Antioch and Alexandria see each other as rivals. How do they run the show? And when Constantine declared that Constantinople was going to become the most important city in the Roman Empire, the sort of like addendum to that was the Constantinopolitan See, the church in Constantinople, was also supposed to be the most important church in the Roman Empire. And of course, Antioch and Alexandria don't see, that as being anything that's going to happen anytime soon. They don't like this idea at all, especially when John Chrysostom is one of the earliest, major bishops in the Constantinopolitan See, and he basically gets run out of town by the emperor 2 or 3 times over his career. So Constantinople doesn't really become that. Constantinople does not become this sort of center of learning or center of religious ideas. But because of its relationship to the political empire, to the Roman emperor himself, it does have a certain amount of precedence and importance. It is an important political city, even if it's not an important theological one. So the issue doesn't become Antioch and Alexandria competing with Constantinople for theological precedence. The issue becomes Antioch and Alexandria trying to get their finger into Constantinople, trying to get one of their guys into the bishopric there so they can influence the emperor and so they can get their particular theology spread throughout the empire. Constantinople is a battleground as far as they're concerned, and it's a puppet battleground. It is not New York City's center of culture. It is Washington, D.C., very much living in the shadow of other eastern cities. We declare this to be an important political place. It will have culture, but that culture will always come from outside. So before we get into the real big fight that's going to take place, namely Nestorius, we have to talk about one other little heresy that we sort of jumped over last time, specifically Apollinaris. Apollinaris of Laodicea is a really kind of weird, controversial figure in Christian history because he was, on the one hand, one of the big heavy hitters against Arianism at the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople afterwards. He was absolutely a defender of orthodoxy, one of the main defenders of orthodoxy, along with Athanasius and the great Cappadocians. But his attitude was very much informed by the Alexandrian mode of thinking, by Origen. He was very into the philosophy side of Christianity at this point. And in the process, his Christology got a little warped. How he defended Nicene Christianity isn't exactly how everybody else in the ancient world would have seen it. Specifically, he saw that Christ, as being one part divine and one part human, was kind of not either in the process. He argued that Christ's composition, based on the Platonic forms that he's dealing with, where there's 3 parts to the human being. There's the human body, the matter, in the Aristotelian sense, and then you've got the rationality, which makes the human reasonable and makes a human, but also the soul, which is what connects you to the gods or God or whatever your version of God in that mindset would be. So his argument is that the Logos, the divine quality of Christ, wasn't actually his soul, that's already divine in all of us, that doesn't make him special, but his divinity comes through the Logos, replacing his human reason. All humans have rationality except Jesus. Jesus' rationality is replaced with divine knowledge, the Logos of John 1, which, as many will argue, means that Christ isn't fully human. He is more divine than human. So Apollinaris is very much arguing that Christ doesn't have 2 natures. He's not human and divine. He's God taking over a body. And that's all. He does not suffer in the same way that people suffer. He does not, have human emotions the way that humans have emotions. He does not suffer from, temptation in the same way that humans do. It's different, because he doesn't have the same faculties as we do. It's very different. So on the one hand, Apollinaris is emphasizing Christ's unity, and on the other, he's emphasizing his divinity over his humanity. And The one thing that I want to stress before we dig into all the Christological controversies today is the lines between orthodoxy and unorthodoxy are going to get really blurry today. Largely because this is something we still haven't sorted out in great detail, for reasons that will become obvious later. We don't know how Jesus works, like how we get God and man united in the same person. We have a couple terms for it, many of which we'll talk about, but it's not clear-cut how it works. Because honestly, we don't know much about like how we work. The philosophical jury is still out on how mind is a thing at all, much less like how it unites to the brain, how that works with the body, and how that works with the soul. Like, it's just a giant mess. So the fact that we don't know means that when it comes to like how does this particular exceptional case, namely Jesus, do both human and God at the same time, like it just blows all of our minds and we can't handle it. So I'm going to, again, as I said before, treat all these guys as though they're believers until proven otherwise. And what I want to stress about most of the people involved, including the ones who get branded as heretics, the main reason why they get branded as heretics, the main reason why there are controversies, has less to do with the hard lines and more to do with the emphasis. What do they stress? Do they highlight certain passages of the Bible to the exclusion of others? In Apollinaris' case, this is an emphasis issue. He emphasizes Christ's divinity and his unity. He would reject the idea that Christ has two natures. He would argue that this composition yields one nature that is primarily divine but also human. And this rubs a lot of theologians the wrong way. So this will get adopted later by the Monophysites. Like, we'll get into the Monophysites again, like the same heresies are just going to keep cropping up over and over and over again throughout this class, and especially today when the same heresy just will not ever go away. But this is one of the major sides, one very much associated with Alexandria, which we will see largely opposed to the Antiochene tendency, which the guy for Antioch is Nestorius. Nestorius is the flashpoint of this Christological issue, this controversy. And Nestorius is the one who gets like unambiguously, no question, he is totally a heretic as far as Christian history is concerned. But honestly, that might also not be fair. Like, Nestorius wasn't a huge theologian. Nestorius was just kind of the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nestorius was definitely aligned with the Antiochenes, which of course makes him a complete enemy to the Alexandrians. The trouble is, Nestorius also got appointed to the See of Constantinople by Theodosius II. As you'll recall, Constantinople is the battleground. So because an Antiochene got into the See of Constantinople, all of the Alexandrians were like, all right, let's do this, let's go. Like, no way are we going to listen to what this guy has to say. So when it turns out that not only does Nestorius have this position, but he's also not very diplomatic about it, it gets really bad really fast. And the specific issue that causes such a problem is the term theotokos, which in Greek is like a compound word that means bearer of Christ. Now, this is going to be the first in a long line of controversies related to Mary. But this is probably the biggest one as they go. Like, we'll get into other Mary stuff later when we talk about Roman Catholicism as it develops. The issue here is that Mary is called Theotokos, bearer of God. And this is kind of a tense issue between the Antiochenes and the Alexandrians. It relies on this doctrine known as the communicatio idiomatum, which is a fancy word for the communication of ideas, or the communication of, like, qualities, which typically in the Christian tradition, anything that you say about Jesus' human half, you can say about Jesus' divine half, and vice versa. So Mary was the bearer of Jesus. Therefore, Mary was the bearer of God. Pretty straightforward in theory. But Nestorius, emphasizing the humanity of Christ up over against his divinity and emphasizing his two natures, rejects that Theotokos is appropriate to say of Mary. Mary was not the mother of God, Mary was the mother of the man Jesus. So this denial, this rejection, very much flies in the face of Alexandrian theology and absolutely is like fighting words as far as the whole Antioch versus Alexandria fight is concerned. For Nestorius to take the See of Constantinople and then come out guns blazing saying, P.S., the one nature attitude is not going to fly anymore, the Alexandrians are now on the defensive. So they sent their guy. After we've got all of this emphasis on humanity and the separation of two natures, Cyril of Alexandria, the bishop of Alexandria at the time, comes out and rejects Nestorius. Says, nope, that is not going to fly. Theotokos is totally a valid thing to say about Jesus. We are going to have this conversation. Now, for Cyril of Alexandria, the term that he is emphasizing, and the one that we emphasize to this day, is the term hypostatic union. We talked about hypostasis before as like the Greek term that sort of gets weirdly supplanted into the whole essence versus person discussion. The idea of the hypostatic union is that there are two subsistences in Christ, two hypostases, the human and the divine, and they are united. This is kind of ambiguous, but the importance from Cyril's perspective is that it is one thing, one united entity. So the two sides that we're talking about today, Nestorius on the one hand is saying Jesus is two natures loosely affiliated through some means that he doesn't bother to describe in most cases. The Alexandrians, including Cyril and Apollinaris before him, are emphasizing the unity of those two natures. There are not two natures, there is one nature formed by what would have been two distinct things once upon a time. Are we clear on this? Because we're going to be talking about this for like another half hour at least. Questions? All right. So Cyril has his hypostatic union, Nestorius is denying Theotokos, and things are starting to get out of hand quickly because Cyril isn't content with just rejecting Nestorius. Cyril wants to knock Nestorius out of the Constantinopolitan See and get an Alexandrian in there instead. His motivation is as much political as it is theological. He is mad at Nestorius not just because Nestorius is wrong about this one particular issue, but because Nestorius is from the wrong team. And this is going to blow up the entire Eastern Church. So naturally, after this goes back and forth for quite a while, of course, it's time for a council. The Theodosius intervenes and says, all right, let's just have it out. We're going to have a big council just like we did at Nicaea. The Council of Ephesus at 431. We're just going to have everybody meet. We're going to have everybody talk. We're going to figure out what's the heresy and what's not the heresy, and we'll go from there. Easy peasy. It only took 2 tries last time, so, what could go wrong this time? So things get started. But the problem is that it's the ancient world, travel isn't terribly reliable, the flights aren't running on time. So John of Antioch, who is the bishop who represents Nestorius in this case, he and the rest of the Antiochian party are 2 weeks late to the council. Nestorius himself gets there on time, no problem, way easier trip. But John is delayed. Meanwhile, Cyril and the Alexandrians, they all show up well on time. So they're all sitting there tapping their watches and like, all right, come on, let's go. Where the heck is John? Like, we need to do this council and get done. And Cyril actually points to a particular line in the emperor's decree that says, hey, could you finish this as soon as possible? And Cyril's like, oh, my hands are tied. Guess we got to start this council right now. So Cyril convenes the council. After 3 days, they're like, all right, Nestorius, you're totally a heretic, and the Alexandrians, you're totally right. There's only one nature for God, and all the rest of you are excommunicated. Anathema, 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 be gone. And it's pretty cut and dry. Hooray! Cyril has basically gotten his entire agenda across. The Antiochians had no chance. Council completed. This is apparently how it's going to go. Except then John shows up. So the one last thing about the Council of Ephesus that will become super important later is that Cyril also puts a clause in there that says, P.S., we're not going to do any more theological innovation. If we didn't say it at Nicaea, it doesn't exist. We're not going to talk about it anymore. Remember this, it will become important. So then John shows up. And he's like, all right, I'm ready for the council. And Nestorius is like, dude, we had the council, we got wrecked. And John's like, that doesn't count, I wasn't there, let's do our own council. So John and Nestorius, they all get together with a bunch of the Antiochian bishops, they have their own council, and surprise, they find that Christ has 2 natures, and that Cyril of Alexandria is totally wrong, so they just excommunicate Cyril, and they excommunicate all of the Alexandrians, and then the Alexandrians get wind of this, and they're like, what? They can't excommunicate us, we excommunicate them! And they're excommunicating each other, and both of them send like messengers to the emperor to tell them about how their council has met and successfully concluded that the other team is totally wrong and is thus excommunicated, and the whole thing is a giant mess. So Theodosius cuts the Gordian knot and arrests everybody. He just takes John and Nestorius and Cyril and chucks them in jail, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to figure this out my way. We're going to lock you up, and you are going to come to a conclusion, and you're going to come to a conclusion that everybody agrees with. So Theodosius convenes his own council, which is technically the Council of Ephesus. All of the other councils don't count at this point. And in this council, we come to an uncomfortable compromise, but it is a compromise largely on Cyril's terms. Cyril is the way more diplomatic of the three participants in this council. So as a result, he's the one who gets the emperor's ear, he's the one who Theodosius ends up listening to, and the resulting reunion formula is very much Cyril's invention. So this is a big compromise that we ultimately come up with. The formula of reunion is the first one you'll see on your bonus page today. It dates to about 433, so this whole messy council business apparently took 2 whole years to actually hash out something that everybody could agree to. The main things I want to draw your attention to, because nobody accepts the formula of reunion as being terribly binding, it is not on the level of the Chalcedonian or the Nicene Creed. The main thing I want to emphasize is that A, Cyril wins. We get the emphasis on Christ's divinity, consubstantial with the Father in Godhead, and we confess the Holy Virgin to be the Mother of God. He is one thing, unity, divinity, that is the primary emphasis. But we do get one key Antiochene passage. For a union of 2 natures took place, which the Antiochenes definitely managed to slip in under the radar or whatever. But the key here is that everybody is unhappy with this formula because it caters to everybody. That's how compromises work. Everybody leaves the table, in theory, equally unhappy. So everybody's upset about this. And not just the Antiochenes and the Alexandrians, but also Pope Leo over in Rome. And a couple of side notes here, because this is probably the first time I've actually uttered the term Pope unironically or without major caveats. Pope Leo the Great is largely considered the first ever real Roman Catholic Pope. He changed the institution in some radical ways, largely because he deserves his moniker, the Great. He did a lot of cool stuff for Rome and the world generally. He especially, he specifically petitioned Valentinian III, one of the earlier emperors, for the primacy of the Roman see. He basically is arguing, this is St. Peter's see, this is the center of the Roman Empire historically, this is a really important church, and therefore if somebody is going to have first voice in the Christian community, it should be this one. Valentinian is like, okay, that checks out, that makes sense, therefore you are Pope, Supreme Pontiff. You are the leader of the entire Christian world. Which, of course, Constantinople doesn't like, and Antioch doesn't like, and Alexandria doesn't like. None of these people take that seriously, but all the same, still super important. And will absolutely be the basis for the Roman popes calling themselves popes and calling themselves the leaders of the Christian world for centuries to come. Keep that in mind. That will also become a major problem later in this session. But also, Pope Leo kind of deserves all the credit that he gets. One of the major things that he does, remember how Attila the Hun is marching through all of Europe and he's wrecking everything as he goes? You're probably wondering at this point, why doesn't he just take over Rome? Well, he tried. He got right up to the door, he's right on the edge of the river, and Pope Leo, with no army, goes out to meet him. And they apparently have a closed-door conference. They talk a little while. Then Pope Leo goes back to Rome and Attila leaves. And that's it. Attila does not invade Rome. Nobody knows why. The historical record is dead silent on why Attila turned around and went home, instead of invading Rome and just completing his conquering of the empire. So Pope Leo saved them at that time. And later, he does the same thing. When the Vandals are sweeping through Africa, they get up to Carthage, and they're like, hey, we're actually really close to Rome. We should totally wreck Rome while we're at it. So they sail up to Italy, and they get ready to sack Rome. And Pope Leo walks out of the city and meets them. And he says, okay, look, we'll give you all of our money. You can come in and take whatever stuff you want, but don't hurt anyone. The Vandals like, deal. And once again, Pope Leo saves the day. So Leo the Great is totally an awesome guy, and I totally support him. And he kind of has a lot of credibility as far as the first pope is concerned. Now, obviously, you talk to a Roman Catholic, and they'll say the first pope was Peter, not Pope Leo. This is typically the way that the Protestants and the Orthodox tend to see it. Like, he is the first pope because he is the first person who assumes the authority associated with popes down the road. So there's a little tension there. And there will be even more later in the session. Again, it's not going to take very long. But the important thing about Leo in this particular moment, in this whole Christological issue, is he recognizes, even having looked at the formula of reunion, that nobody is on the right side here. Weirdly, like I said with Tertullian before, the West is frequently the person who is moderating the Eastern controversies. So Leo looks at this whole mess between Cyril and Nestorius, and he's like, both of you were heretics. Nestorius is a heretic because his theology is terrible, but Cyril condemns Nestorius using all this heretical language and is clearly making heretical statements in the process. Both of you are wrong. Both of your condemnations are totally out of line. So Leo is not happy. He is not happy with the formula of reunion. He is not happy with Cyril retaining his see. He is not happy with Nestorius still hanging around. Like, he is not happy. But he's off in Rome, so who cares? Like, they're not even politically powerful anymore because they got taken over. But the Alexandrians are also very unhappy because they got that two natures clause in there. We just cannot do the two natures clause. And the Alexandrians, after Cyril of Alexandria dies and gives up his power to his follower, we end up with Pope Dioscorus I of Alexandria. And you'll notice that this time I put Pope in parentheses because he is considered the first Pope of the Coptic Church, for reasons we're going to get into later in this session. Dioscorus I, or Dioscorus, as we will talk about him here, Dioscorus is absolutely a politiker. Like, he does not have that much interest in theology, but he absolutely wants to see Alexandria take out Antioch once and for all. And he is moving his pieces carefully and gradually to get them all into position so he can ultimately take out the Antiochenes. And it takes him a little while. Like, he sees a couple of new bishops show up in Antioch, and there's one particularly weak one, and he's like, this is going to be my guy, this is my opportunity, I just need the right moment. And then the moment arrives. There's this dude named Eutyches, one of the monks from one of the Egyptian monasteries, and he starts mouthing off about how Nestorius and the Antiochenes are all the same. All the Antiochenes are complete heretics. They all believe in this two natures nonsense. And he rejects both the two natures formula from the reunion formula, and he rejects the entire Antiochean theology altogether. He doesn't see a distinction. And part of this is because Eutyches doesn't have a huge grasp on theology, it seems. Like, most of his statements seem really confused and really kind of out there. But this becomes the big controversy. This is the guy who everyone is circulating around. And once again, he's becoming a major problem. So the emperor needs to call yet another council. The Second Council of Ephesus in 449. It's time to find out whether this Eutyches guy is a heretic or not. But Theodosius II decides that Dioscorus is going to be the guy running the council. And Dioscorus sees his opportunity when he's got it. So Dioscorus starts by ignoring Leo's complaints. See, Leo recognizes there's another council going to happen. Okay, great. This time, Leo's not going to mess around and let them screw it all up. He's going to write his missive, his tome. He's going to send it to Ephesus, since he can't go himself. And they're going to read the tome, and he will condemn Eutyches there and explain how the two natures formula is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Eutyches is clearly out of his mind. Nobody should trust that guy. But Dioscorus is in charge, so, you know what? Who cares? Next, Dioscorus totally stacks the council with Alexandrian bishops. He is going to make sure that there's way more Alexandrians than Antiochenes in this particular council. Then he's going to take another step, and he's going to stand on that one little passage I told you to remember from the Council of Ephesus that said no new theology after Nicaea. So he's not going to listen to anything new. Nope. If you're going to suggest anything that sounds like anything other than Nicaea, we're not going to hear it. It's Nicaea or that's it. So, no problem. But importantly, what he decides to call dissenting voices or innovations are the people who disagree with him. So he has a little bit too much power in this situation. As for Leo's tome, the big, forget Eutyches, he's a bad deal, doesn't even get read. Nobody at the council besides Dioscorus even knows that Pope Leo sent something, so it gets completely ignored. So naturally, Dioscorus stands up and says, Eutyches, that guy's totally all right. Everything he says is totally legit, totally orthodox. He is absolutely right that the Antiochenes are all heretics and we should just excommunicate the whole lot of them. And so we excommunicate the whole lot of them. And for his theological purposes, he stresses that two natures formula, totally heretical. Christ has one nature, that's it. The Alexandrians were right all along. The council proves it. Hooray! Look at the triumph of Alexandria over Antioch. And Leo especially calls them out on it. This is nonsense. The Antiochians know it because they just totally got wrecked in this council, but Leo is also really upset about it because his book didn't get read, so he calls this the Robbers' Synod. And this is how it goes down in history. Not as the Second Council of Ephesus, but the Robbers' Synod, or the Robbers' Council, because it is clearly this political artifice constructed by Dioscorus to totally wreck the Antiochenes and for no actual legitimate theological purpose. This is probably the first time that Christianity gets totally hijacked by politics. Although at this point at least it's Christian politics. It won't be forever. So Theodosius then is petitioned, hey, let's have a new council, but Theodosius dies. Right in the middle of this giant mess, the emperor who has been trying to make this work just croaks. He falls off his horse and he's dead. And his followers, fortunately, happen to support Leo. So they do, in fact, after a couple of years, declare yet another council, the Council of Chalcedon, 451. And in this one, we're going to actually make sure that everyone gets a pretty fair chance to be heard. So Antiochenes and Alexandrians, although with some skepticism, and also a group from Rome will all meet at Chalcedon, and they're going to sort this out for real this time. And at this point, we're just going to condemn Eutyches straight out. That guy clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Forget him. We're going to totally banish Dioscorus because of all of his crazy political figuring. So forget that guy. He will die in exile several years afterwards. We're going to put the rest of the Alexandrians can go back to their sees and be bishops and priests and whatever. That's fine. We're not going to completely humiliate the Alexandrian party. This is not like the Antiochenes strike back. This is an attempt to put everyone on equal ground. So what we ultimately come up with is the Chalcedonian Creed, which is in fact a legitimate creed and is important and does hold up and is one of the ones that we hold pretty dear. And while I do not want to cover, again, the whole thing because it's rather long, I want to emphasize that it's fairly even-handed here. It stresses both Antiochian and Alexandrian talking points without affirming either. So, we all unanimously teach our Lord Jesus Christ is to us one and the same Son, the self-same, perfect in Godhead, perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man. Notice the even-handedness. No emphasis on either his humanity or his divinity. Both are equal. We also have several Alexandrian passages. He is born of Mary the Virgin Theotokos. We are confirming Theotokos is, in fact, orthodox. Mary was the bearer of God. The Communicatio Idiomatum holds. As long as you understand that Mary bore the human side of Christ, and that can be talked about in terms of the godly, divine side of Christ, not as though Mary also bore, God the Father. There are clarifications to be made here. One and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten. One Christ, one person. Even though he is acknowledged in two natures, but unconfusedly, unchangeably. Notice how it keeps going back and forth. He is one, he is two. He is one, he is two. He is one, he is two. No preference. He has two natures united, unconfusedly. But notice that it doesn't say how. There's no, was it the Logos united to the flesh? Was it like he has 50% human and 50% God qualities? The Creed is not interested. The Creed is deliberately ambiguous. The Creed specifically wants to open up the possibility of an Alexandrine tendency and an Antiochian tendency. Both are Christian, is what is being said here, as long as you don't emphasize one to the exclusion of the other. The Chalcedonian Creed is basically saying, here is the space, and there is a bunch of it. Feel free to explore what Christ is within that space. Do not say Christ has only one nature, because he has two. Do not say that his two natures are divided and separate, because they are united. I don't know how it works. They don't know how it works. Nobody knows how this works, except possibly God and Jesus himself. And thus we are going to work with a big question mark. The Chalcedonian Creed is like, here are the boundaries, and whatever is inside, no idea. That's Christianity. And this harkens back to a lot of what has constituted orthodoxy throughout the Christian history. There are a lot of different viewpoints that Christianity can include. Now, admittedly, some of them are not included. Arianism is outside of those bounds. Donatism is outside of those bounds. Quite a few of the heretics we're talking about are outside of these bounds. And today we can say the same about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. But as far as what is inside, it can include people with an Nestorian tendency, people with an Apollinarian tendency, people who want to emphasize the divinity of Christ, and people who want to emphasize the humanity of Christ, so long as they both recognize both. Does that make sense? Questions?
Where's the Holy Spirit in all of it?
Yeah, again, Chalcedon was very much devoted to like Jesus specifically. So, as admittedly you will see like God the Father hanging out in here, but not very much, and the Holy Spirit, of course, gets completely shafted in this creed. Unlike the Nicene Creed, which was intended to sort of cover the entirety of the Trinity, this is just about Jesus. So, you know, it's not, it's like you can't make every creed do everything. This was specifically directed at this particular issue, this particular controversy, this particular heresy. Other questions? All right. Now, this is pretty good, and most people can agree to this, including people on both sides of this sort of political issue. But it doesn't resolve it. Like, as much as I would like to say, like, this is it, hooray, we figured out Jesus as best as we're going to, and now everybody's happy, no, it doesn't. Because at this point, it's bigger than theology. Like I've stressed all of this session, this is very much a political issue as much as it's a theological one. This is about, I root for my home team, the Antiochians, versus the other home team, the Alexandrians. So it's not going to get resolved with a theological resolution. There's still bad blood there. So a lot of the people in the Alexandrian faction will go off and become the Monophysites. And they will hang out in the Eastern Roman Empire, and they will still frustrate politics and frustrate theology and be like a big pain in the butt for years to come. This problem isn't going away because it's not just about Christianity anymore. Again, the theological issue is just the sort of stage where other sort of quieter issues are going on. The world is dividing, is what it comes down to. It's factionalizing. People are getting grumpy within the boundaries of what are supposedly their empire. So it's not going to resolve that easily. The other issue here is that the Chalcedonian Creed also drops like its last canon, and it's like, P.S. Constantinople has the same primacy as Rome. And guess what? Rome rejects this. It's like, we accept the Chalcedonian Creed, but that last one about like Constantinople being the same as Rome, nobody buys that. Honestly, I doubt anyone in the East took it terribly seriously, especially with, again, Antioch and Alexandria being sort of like the dominant theological centers at this point. But it would kind of come true in its own right, even though the West is increasingly inclined to reject this particular detail, as will become even more obvious. But this is also a moment when the entire empire is metamorphosing. We are going from the Eastern Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire. An empire with its own identity, separated from the West, an empire with its own sort of priorities and culture and tradition and heritage, and it's going to be its own thing in a very real sense. And the Byzantines, like I said, are going to be doing a lot of really cool stuff while the West is largely doing the Dark Ages and having a lot of trouble figuring out what's going on. And one of the major players who I want to talk about, like the biggest and most important emperor in the Byzantine age, is Justinian I, as pictured here, with his fancy crown. Justinian was the last great mover and shaker of the Eastern Roman Empire. He is the last person to try and expand the empire, to rebuild it, to make it great again, so to speak. And he succeeds in large part, though the costs may be too high at the end of the day. His ultimate goal is to bring the empire back to its former glory, which means, first of all, fixing the problems that they have now, specifically taxes and laws. There are a bunch of rich people evading taxes. Surprise, this has been going on for 2,000 years and change. And there's this massive mess of laws like that are based on a city-by-city basis, and like it's thousands of years of like compiled legal traditions. So he has a couple of guys sort both of them out. We're going to fix the taxes so everybody gets properly taxed. We're going to fix the laws so like there's one unified legal code for everyone. And P.S., like literally every legal tradition today is based on the Justinian Code, including ours. Like his legacy is immense. But of course, if you're going to unify your big empire, you're going to also have to unify the territory itself. So Justinian actually takes over Rome at one point. He conquers Rome back from the Ostrogoths after a long, involved campaign. He conquers a big chunk of northern Africa. Things are starting to look like the Roman Empire again. P.S. It all falls apart in like 20 years, but oh well, it was a good run. And largely the reason why it falls apart is because it's the first ever recorded instance of the Black Plague showing up and wrecking things. So this goes poorly. Justinian himself actually comes really close to dying because of the Black Plague. So it's real awkward. But of course, the last thing you're going to do if you're going to be unifying your big empire is you've got to bring the church back together again. You've got all these Nestorians hanging up around Antioch. You've got all these Alexandrian Monophysites hanging around in Egypt and Alexandria. You've got now actual schisms, like the Coptic church. The Egyptian church has become its own thing and is sort of separated from the Orthodox church and practices Monophysitism openly. And is allied to the Ethiopian church, and there's a whole mess there. Increasingly, the church is becoming fractured because of these disagreements, and Justinian is like, okay, we gotta fix that too. And one of the last things he does as emperor is he convenes the next ecumenical council, the fifth one, for those of you counting, and he tries to stitch it back together again. And his thought is that this whole Monophysitism thing is mostly just a verbal argument. Like, this is not an actual disagreement. We do not disagree about what Jesus is actually like. We're disagreeing about how to talk about it, how to phrase it. Everybody, for the most part in the Byzantine Empire, agrees with the Chalcedonian Creed. Like, they all agree to the terms laid out there. But the problem that most Monophysites and Alexandrians have is that the creators of the creed, the engineers, the people who wrote about it afterwards, these guys stress that Antiochian position, they can't have that. So Justinian sort of spins it so that his argument isn't against the creed, his argument is against these guys, the three chapters, these three particular written texts that most of Orthodoxy has accepted, but which the Alexandrian Monophysites mostly reject. So in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, he critiques and condemns the three chapters. And he's like, okay, so we fixed it. It's not Antiochian focused. Everybody can agree to the creed. We all agree to the creed. The creed is all that matters. Let's call it a day. But again, this isn't about theology anymore, and hasn't been for 100 years. So more Monophysite heresies start to spring up as a result. Specifically, monergism, which suggests that Christ is like, you know, these two natures, but he is united in one energy. Like, he's only got one energy coming from God, and it's like through that energy that he acts, and that just defines all his behavior. And on the other hand, we have the Monothelites, who are saying it's all one will, and Christ always performs from the same will. Like, even though he may have two, a human and divine nature, at the end of the day, he has only one will united in both, and it's that will that guides him forward. And we have to convene yet another ecumenical council in 681 to reject both of these heresies while we are at it. But again, like I keep stressing, this isn't going to fix it. This is a cultural thing now. It has its own life force. It's way beyond Christianity's ability to deal with at this point. because it's not about Christianity. And the way that this ultimately gets solved is kind of tragic. Namely, the Arabs sweep through and take over everyone.
Yeah.
The Islamic conquest springs up in the middle of the 7th century, in like 630 to 650-ish. And in this process, like, first Muhammad founds the whole of Islam. Like, he gets his, his vision from the Archangel Michael, and he writes it all down, and this is the Quran, the sacred text, which is like super different from the way that Christianity works. But in the process, he goes on all these military campaigns. Like, starting from Medina, he expands to Mecca and takes over a decent chunk of the Arabian Peninsula, expands to all corners of the Arabian Peninsula, and then after Muhammad's death, they keep going, and they expand and they expand and they expand. They take over Syria, they take over Jerusalem, they take over Persia, take over modern-day Iraq and Iran. They sweep through northern Africa. And by the next generation, they're sweeping through the rest of northern Africa, and they're actually making inroads into Spain, which is going to be a big deal in its own right. They expand very rapidly. Islam is, I don't want to say that it's war-friendly, but it's probably more war-friendly than Christianity is. Its ambiguity on the subject of conflict is difficult to grasp. Like the Bible, which, if you go up to somebody on the street and say, like, let's talk about faith, and then you get into the whole faith works discussion, the Bible is sort of like emphasizing faith in some places, emphasizing work in others. The Quran very much emphasizes peace in some places and emphasizes war in others. It's not 100% clear. Like, I try and push back against anyone who says, the Quran is just a peaceful text, or the Quran is just a text that, like, legitimizes terrorism. Both are true or untrue, and often in the same passages. Like, there's a passage in the Quran that people like to quote completely out of context, where it's like, when you are taking over an enemy empire, make sure that you listen to them and are peaceful if they decide to convert. But if they don't convert, then you wreck them utterly. But if they do, like, if they're Christians or Jews, then you let them be Christians and Jews. It's not a big deal, they're our brothers. But if they refuse to commit to it, it's just like, what are we doing? Like, what is in fact the policy here? So it's like, I'm definitely not a scholar of the Quran or of Islam in general, but I do want to sort of clarify that it is not cut and dry. Our book is complicated, their book is complicated. That's the way it goes. Now, I don't want to get too deep into Islam because this is a class on Christian history, and while Islam definitely factors into that, I don't want to, like, get completely off tangent, but does anyone have any questions about Islam before we sprint onward? Because I know that there's a lot floating around.
If you could, is there a sentence or a phrase, like we have monergism is that one energy, and the other one is one will. So what would you say the Islamic theme is?
One God. Like, if you can boil it down to one thing, that's what it comes down to. Islam follows the Old Testament and in fact accepts most of the Old Testament. It also largely accepts the New. It considers Jesus a prophet, but a failed prophet, because he died, and that's not great. But Islam overwhelmingly emphasizes there is one God, Allah. We follow him. We are the inheritors of the promise through Abraham. They see Ishmael as the chosen son, not Isaac, and therefore the Arabic world is inheriting the promise to Ishmael through God. So, like, they see themselves as being of a piece with Judaism and Christianity, but it's, again, unclear how exactly that's supposed to look in practice. So, again, I don't want to err on the side of either giving Islam too much credit or giving Islam not enough, or, it's a tough line to walk, and again, I don't know everything about it. But if there's anything that we can take away from Islam, like, that we should admire, it's how rigorously they respect and revere their God and their faith. Like, they would not tolerate the sort of nonsense that we let, like, go on TV all the time about Jesus. Like, I mean, you hear stories about, like, a political cartoonist in France portrays Muhammad, and, like, everyone gets upset. Whereas, like, you can put Jesus on Family Guy or South Park, and nobody even bats an eye at this point. They take their faith really seriously, and that's admirable. Obviously, like, the extremists among them can take it too far. But you can say the same thing about Christians, too. Any other questions while we're on the topic? Again, I don't want to get too deep.
It's not a question, I just want
Shoot.
to make a comment about Islam and the Quran. Okay. They do accept the fact that, again, they're basically Old Testament. They accept the fact that Jesus was born. As a matter of fact, a lot of them think he was born of a virgin.
Okay.
They don't believe, however, that he is Messiah or was
Yes.
Messiah. As you said, they simply believe that he was a prophet.
Yep.
Okay? And that he was also prophesied in the Old Testament. And I just want to tell you something about Islam. The Islamic center for this area happens to be in Rockaway, where I live. I do go down there if I have a question about what they believe. And as you had pointed out, and it doesn't matter because we're not studying Islam,
Yeah.
they are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet.
Yes.
So they're one of those wolves in sheep's clothing, you might say.
Yeah.
But they do accept, as you said, they do live by our Old Testament,
Yes.
you might say. So I just wanted to say that if you ever have any questions about them, stop in at their center.
Yeah.
They're very welcome.
Yep.
Not that it matters.
Right. Well.
Also, the gentleman at the Sunoco station
mhm.
asked us to pray for him because they were having their Friday, it was, I guess, India, whatever it is,
Okay.
their celebration for forgiveness of sins where they sacrifice a lamb.
Right.
And
Yeah, I've had a number of Muslim students, and they, again, they're people. Like, some of them are really great students, some of them are not so great. Like, they are frequently very nice. They're sometimes not so nice. Like, I'm a teacher, you know, I get all kinds. But importantly, like, in the same way that the media tends to present us as a bunch of, like, crazy dogmatic monsters who only care about abortion and gay marriage, so the media frequently depicts Islam as though it's all just a bunch of terrorists. We are both maligned. So, you know, if there is a message to take away from my complete, like, madness on Islam and from Don's interjection, it's they're humans, just like us. They sin, and they do great things. It's how it works. Broad descriptions frequently just won't cut it. Like, again, I can say, you know, they're all about one God, because that's what they would tell you in most cases. Like, anytime I ask, that's the answer I get. But at the end of the day, it's complicated. Like, the relationship between these faiths is really complicated. But again, Christian history. So let's talk about instead the effects of the conquest. How does our world, our Christian perspective, change as a result of this new force coming in and sweeping through Europe and Africa and Byzantium and everything? So first off, as far as the Eastern Empire is concerned, the major issues here are both the Monophysites and the Nestorians get wiped out. Like, they get conquered. One of the major conquests that the new Muslim conquest takes over is Egypt, which is Alexandria. So the Alexandrians are kind of removed from the equation. The Eastern Roman Empire no longer has to concern themselves with them. There is no dissenting voice because Alexandria is not a part of the empire anymore. And the same is true about Antioch and the Nestorians. They're both kind of eliminated from the equation. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is now a new threat. Like, Christendom in general is going to see Islam as a threat, that these are heretics, these are blasphemers, these are barbarians, which is totally inappropriate for reasons we'll get into later, but nonetheless, like, we're going to see this as a potential political issue. And frequently it will come down to, like, I have to defend my border with Arabia, either in Spain or in Turkey or wherever, in order to get whatever I'm doing done. And this, of course, will lead us to the Crusades in the next couple of weeks when, you know, Christianity actually decides to declare war on the Islamic world. As far as the Western Roman Empire is concerned, it's a pretty similar situation. When Islam sweeps through northern Africa, they wipe out a bunch of the heresies that have cropped up there, including Donatism, Pelagianism, and the various Vandal forces. Many of those we'll talk about when we talk about Augustine, because Augustine was especially concerned with them. But where in the East the churches tend to subsist In northern Africa, they fall apart. The Vandals were not Christians, so when they took over all the North African cities, the Christian churches there were very much weakened and disorganized. When the Arabs sweep through again, they just knock them out. Like, there's very little Christianity remaining in Carthage and the other major North African centers that we've been used to talking about. So in that sense, like, the Western Roman Empire is very much isolated, which is itself going to be a major issue. The Western Roman Empire, what was the Western Roman Empire, what is now like Europe trying to figure itself out, is going to be surrounded by Islam on virtually all sides and by Orthodox Christianity in the southeast, which means that they don't have any more trading partners. They're not going to be able to like trek across Muslim territory to meet with other people. Things are going to shut down and get isolated really quickly, which is going to usher in a whole new worldview, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. So keep that in mind, that the Western Church is going to very much be on its own for the next 500 years at the very least. But the other thing I want to talk about is that their attack of Spain is going to be this sort of like very tense situation for, again, 500 plus years. The Western Church is going to constantly see the potential Arabic incursion as a big threat that needs to be dealt with. People will be fighting in Spain, people will be fighting to take over Jerusalem. The Crusades are largely going to be motivated by the fact that people are afraid of Muslims, because they're different, is what it basically comes down to. But on the other side, in the Islamic world itself, within the borders of what Arabia is at this point in time, there's also a bunch of new changes taking place. And particularly, like, I've tried to stress that Byzantium is kind of doing all right while the West is in the Dark Ages in a giant mess. But Arabia is thriving during this same period. Like, what we call the Dark Ages for us is like the golden age for Arabian culture. While we're like sorting out feudal wars, and while there's like massive political struggles for the bishoprics and stuff, Islam is doing science, they're doing philosophy. Remember, they took over Alexandria, the center of knowledge, where the museum was, where the library was, although admittedly it's not around anymore. And in the process, they've retained Plato and Aristotle and all the great philosophers. And the Arabic philosophers, these Islamic philosophers, are trying to synthesize Islam with philosophy in the same way that the Christians have been doing for the last 500 years and will continue to do for the next 1,000. Additionally, they're doing some really impressive things scientifically. They're inventing telescopes, they're inventing compasses, they're inventing like all sorts of new devices for measuring the world. They invent the first mechanical clock. Like, they do some really impressive stuff that they do not get enough credit for, because again, when we talk about world history, we're typically talking about people who look like us, which is a mess. So I want to stress that they actually have a really high standard of living in the world, especially at this moment in time when everybody else is, clawing for the next piece of bread. But as for the Christian church, it doesn't do so well, unsurprisingly. Most of the Christian churches in the Islamic world are cut off from the rest of the churches. They will not participate in most of the conversations, but it also means that they're not going to be looking to like Constantinople or to Rome for their definition of what is Orthodox. And since a lot of these churches were on fairly tenuous ground with Orthodoxy in the first place, they're just going to go in on what they believe. And this includes a bunch of different sort of splintered churches as far as Orthodoxy is concerned. We're talking about the Coptic church, like I mentioned, the Egyptian church, which is very heavily Monophysite. We're talking about the Persian and the Syrian churches, also heavily Monophysite. The Ethiopian church, which was very much its own thing, completely separate from both Constantinople and Rome, which had close ties to the Coptic church, so they're sort of influenced Monophysite as well. Additionally, it's just, all of these churches are going to just disappear as far as the mainline discussion of church history is concerned, but they have their own history with their own traditions and their own understanding of how Christianity works. Remember how I said earlier that Dioscorus I is called the Pope in the Coptic church? Well, think about it. He is the head guy for the Monophysites, who absolutely supports the Monophysite church to the point of wrecking the Antiochenes. Of course the Coptics are going to see him as the first true pope. So their traditions, if I don't know much about Orthodoxy, I definitely don't know much about many of these. So I highly encourage you, like, if you run into somebody from one of these churches, talk to them about it. Like, ask them questions. See where we agree and where we disagree. And probably it'll be rooted in these same historical discussions that I'm talking about today. So there are a lot of splinter churches here, is what I want to emphasize. As for what's going on in Orthodoxy proper for the rest of the next, like, 400 to 500 years, I want to talk about a few brief points because they're important, and then we can call it a day. So the first thing, of course, is the iconoclast controversy. This is the issue with icons. If you have friends who are Roman Catholic or friends who are Orthodox, you will know they have pictures, they have little statues of various saints, of various, like, biblical figures, and they will pray to them. We Protestants consider this a huge violation of that no images policy laid out in the Ten Commandments, but there's actually a rich theological history behind this discussion, and it kind of comes to a culmination in about the 7th and 8th century in Byzantium, when the emperor and company become antagonistic to icons. They want to eliminate them from the service, while another group stands up for them, the iconophiles. So this becomes a huge theological issue in its own right. On the one hand, you have the iconoclasts, they want to get rid of the icons. On the other hand, you have the iconophiles, they want to keep worshiping the icons. And this actually culminates in yet another ecumenical council, the last of our major ecumenical councils in the East, the 7th ecumenical council in the 8th century. And this is another one where, like, the West gets its digs in, but not very much, because at this point they're pretty well alienated. We'll talk about that. But what this basically boils down to is terminology. For the East, you can venerate your icons, but not worship them, using the word latria. You do not worship them, you do not pray to them the way that you pray to God. You venerate them as a symbol of the person that they represent, or as other, as a pointer to the people that they represent, or figures, or whatever. Now, this is itself really different from the West. The West participates in this, in this controversy. They get their digs in, but ultimately they reject this council. For the West, it's not about veneration or worship at all. Icons are pointers. You do not pray to them, you pray through them. And this is actually something that one of my friends at Boston College, like, her PhD is all about this, so I know a weird amount about icons from talking to her. But like I said, there is a rich theological tradition here. The way that it is understood in both of these cultures is that because Jesus was, a person, because he was made flesh, because he because he had an image, it's therefore okay to portray him, and therefore okay to portray other human beings who carry the Holy Spirit like saints. And so this is obviously really deeply connected to the veneration of saints, and then you get into this whole issue of who's a saint, who's a heretic, who's, it's just a giant mess. But nonetheless, I want to stress, like, this is a discussion that has been had that is not just, like, pure ignorance that causes people to worship icons. It's rooted in a tradition we disagree with, and for good reason, but a tradition nonetheless. Now, the other conflicts in late Byzantine theology are mostly with the Western Church. And in fact, this whole period of history, the, 500 years between Justinian conquering Rome again and sort of unifying the empire for the last time, and this point, in the 11th century when the Crusades were starting to kick up, is just time after time after time, the West and the East are going to butt heads over things ranging from really important theological issues to really dumb stuff. So probably the biggest thing, the key issue here, is what is known as the Filioque Clause. You'll remember back when we talked about the Nicene Creed, I specifically wanted to emphasize that it had this passage about how the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Well, somewhere in the 7th or 8th or something century, we're not entirely sure where because there wasn't a formal creed about it, Western theologians started including in the Nicene Creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son, Filioque, and is que, Filii is Son. So they go to the East and they're like, here's our Nicene Creed, let's talk about the Nicene Creed, and they say from the Son, and everyone's like, no, you can't do that. Now the Romans, they're like, well, it does. The Holy Spirit comes from the Father, it also comes from the Son, they're equal powers, it comes from both. But for the East, it's a completely different issue. They're missing the point. you can't change the creed, is what the East is saying. You can't just like make additions. We don't care if it's theologically true. We said Nicene Creed, we said you don't mess with the Nicene Creed. Now you come up and you've got these weird changes that you're making. No, you can't do that. And it's not resolved. There's not like a big council that fixes this. In fact, part of the issue is part of the reason why this is such a big issue is because the Pope is not that diplomatic at this point. And he sends an especially undiplomatic envoy to have this conversation with the East. So basically everybody just leaves angry and convinced that they are right. Additionally, that whole thing about like Rome is the most important church keeps coming up. Constantinople got told in the Chalcedonian conference, you are on the same footing as the Roman church. And they're like, dude, did you read the Chalcedonian Creed? And the Pope was like, we don't pay attention to the Chalcedonian Creed, it's dumb. So there's increasingly this issue between the two churches. In fact, like the best compromise they come up with at one point is what they call the Petrarchy, which is like they declare 5 churches to be the most important, namely Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and one more, I don't remember which. I think it's Jerusalem. And then it's like whatever the majority says, that's what goes. Like theology is whatever 3 of the 5 say. And everyone's like, that's a really cool compromise. And we don't like it because I live in this place and they should have privacy. Like it's just a mess, and it's a lot of arguing, and it comes to zero conclusion. The other thing is, this becomes really political when all of a sudden there's this church in Bulgaria that starts up, and everyone's like, so who do they follow? It's like equidistant from the East and the West. So are they going to follow the Western church and do the Latin Mass, or are they going to follow the Eastern church and do the Greek Mass, or their own Mass, or like who gets to set? And it's a huge issue, and obviously a lot of political infighting on that as well. And then we get into the more fiddly stuff. The West is increasingly dealing with this issue of should priests be celibate? The monks especially are pushing for clerical celibacy. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. And now it's starting to filter over. They're like, guys, you guys in the Eastern Old Church, you should know better than to allow your priest to be married. And the Orthodox is like, where did this come from? What are you talking about? So again, you have yet another thing to separate the two. But the last, and perhaps best, is the issue of the Eucharist. Because the West insists you can't have yeast in the bread, because Passover, and the East is like, dude, Passover is done. Christ is here. Sacrifice is made. We use yeast in our bread. They're like, oh, you yeasty people. I can't handle any of that yeast nonsense in my Jesus. So eventually this leads into the Great Schism of 1054. And while this is sort of like the breaking point where the relation between West and East like explicitly falls apart, I want to stress this was a long time coming and honestly doesn't change that much. What actually happens is the Orthodox Church, like, they have a bunch of churches in Italy, which is, of course, right next door to the Pope. So the Pope, like, comes in and he's like, all right, you're all Latin churches now. You're going to speak Latin, you're going to do Latin, you're going to do whatever I tell you. They're like, Patriarch of Constantinople, help us! So naturally, there's envoys sent back and forth. And finally, Pope Leo IX, who is not nearly as cool as Pope Leo the Great, sends Cardinal Humbert, who is an absolute jerk, to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael I Carolarius, and he's like, well, if you guys have to acknowledge, you know, Rome is the first church, we're the most important one, you guys are not nearly as important, and also you guys aren't practicing celibacy like we told you to, and you're not doing the unleavened bread for the Jesus Eucharist thing, so, you know, shape up, now is the time, and of course Michael Carolarius is like, who are you and why should I care? So naturally, they each excommunicate one another, and now the church is officially split, and they are not going to hang out together anymore. Which is nonsense, because they spend a lot of time helping each other, and everything is, like, nothing changes. Throughout this period, and for the next 200 years, while Constantinople is still a thing, and not Istanbul under the hands of the Turks, they are going to ask for help from the West with their military problems. They're going to say, hey, can you send a crusade? We're having some problems. And the West will do the same, like, hey, the Norman conquest is happening. Can you send us some troops? And both of them will mutually ignore one another, or maybe help if it's politically expedient. At one point, Constantinople gets conquered by the West. Oops, that happened. It's a giant mess, but it was, again, a long time coming. What I want to stress, as I have stressed throughout, is that this very much is beyond Christianity at this point. Because Christianity under Constantine has ascended to the role where it is now a major player in the empire, it has one foot in the theological world and one foot in the human world. And as a result, when this world starts dragging it away, you got to rebalance sometimes. So a lot of the problems we're going to see are just going to be further increasing exacerbations of this. On the one hand, in the East, what you can see is the church very much getting pulled along by politics. You have the emperor saying, okay, we're going to do it this way. We're going to unite the church so we can unite the empire. And theology is just going to have to come along with it. In the West, it's going to be the opposite problem. Theology is going to be in charge. But because issues in politics and human greed does not change, theology is going to move as a result of that anyway, only under its own volition. So next week we're going to talk about Augustine, and we're going to talk about the very early parts of the Western Roman Empire and the Western Church and Roman Catholicism proper. And then for the 2 weeks after that, we're going to talk about the development through the Middle Ages all the way through the Renaissance. So any questions before we take off?